I'm done pretending my husband's allergies aren't just him being picky, because I'm exhausted from planning every single meal around his dramatic reactions. My husband Kevin and I have been married for 4 years and together for 6. When we first started dating, he told me he had severe food sensitivities, and I thought that meant actual allergies. I was so careful in the beginning. I would read every label and ask restaurants about ingredients and make sure nothing he ate would hurt him. But after living with him for years, I've started to realize that his reactions are completely inconsistent, and I think he's just been using this as an excuse to control what we eat. He claims he can't eat dairy, but I've seen him eat pizza at his friend's house when he didn't know I was watching. He says gluten makes him sick, but he'll eat his mom's homemade bread without any issues. He tells me onions give him migraines, but he devours the onion rings at his favorite sports bar. Every time I point out these inconsistencies, he tells me that his sensitivities come and go, and that stress affects how his body reacts. He says I wouldn't understand, because I don't have a sensitive system like he does. But somehow his system is only sensitive when I'm the one cooking. I've spent 6 years avoiding foods I love because of him. I haven't made my grandmother's famous lasagna since we got married because it has ricotta cheese. I can't bake regular bread because of the gluten. I've completely changed how I cook and shop and eat just to accommodate him. Last week was my breaking point. I had spent 3 hours making a special dinner for his birthday. I made gluten-free pasta with dairy-free sauce and used all the expensive substitute ingredients he claims he needs. I was so proud of myself for pulling it off. He took one bite and pushed the plate away. He said something tasted off and that he could tell I used the wrong brand of dairy-free cheese. He said his throat felt scratchy and his stomach was already hurting just from that one bite. I asked him which brand I should have used and he couldn't even tell me. He just said he knows his body and something was wrong with the food. I was so hurt that I didn't say anything. I just cleaned up the kitchen and went to bed. The next day, I decided to run an experiment. I made him a regular grilled cheese sandwich with real cheese and real butter on regular bread. I told him it was a new gluten-free, dairy-free bread I found and that the cheese was made from cashews. He ate the entire thing and said it was the best sandwich I had ever made him. He asked me to buy more of that bread because it finally tasted like real food. I didn't tell him the truth right away. I waited 3 days to see if he would have any reaction at all. Nothing. No headaches, no stomach issues, no scratchy throat. He was completely fine. On the 4th day, I told him what I had done. I expected him to be relieved that maybe his sensitivities weren't as bad as he thought. Instead, he exploded. He accused me of poisoning him and said I had violated his trust. He said he couldn't believe I would experiment on him like some kind of lab rat. He told me that just because he didn't have a visible reaction didn't mean I hadn't done internal damage to his body. He said I was the worst wife in the world for not respecting his health issues. I told him his health issues weren't real, and that I had just proved it. I said he had been manipulating me for 6 years into cooking only what he wanted to eat, and I was done. I told him from now on I was going to cook normal food, and he could either eat it or make his own meals. He called his mother crying, and now she's texting me saying I'm an abusive wife for tricking him. His sister said I could have killed him if he really was allergic and that I'm lucky nothing happened. My own mother said what I did was wrong, even if I was right about him faking. Kevin has been sleeping in the guest room for 5 days and refuses to eat anything I make now. He orders takeout every night and makes a big show of reading the ingredients on everything. He told me yesterday that he's considering couples therapy because what I did broke something in our marriage. I told him I would love to go to therapy so a professional can explain to him that he's been controlling me through fake allergies for our entire relationship. He said I was impossible to talk to and that I've become a completely different person. But I'm not a different person. I'm just finally done pretending. Last night, his mother called and told me something that made my jaw drop. She told me Kevin was 7 years old at a birthday party when he ate spoiled dairy from a cake that had been sitting out too long in the summer heat. He threw up 17 times in 2 days and ended up in the hospital with tubes in his arms and machines beeping around him. Natalia said he wouldn't eat anything for a week after they brought him home because he was so scared of getting sick again. His pediatrician explained that the fear was causing real pain in his stomach, and that Kevin's body was reacting to the anxiety like it was an actual threat. She said Kevin's dad would roll his eyes whenever Kevin refused food and call him dramatic in front of his friends. The mocking made Kevin feel like he had to hide how scared he was, which made the stomach pain even worse. Natalia's voice cracked when she told me this, and I could hear her crying through the phone. She said she should have protected Kevin better from his father's comments, but she didn't know how bad it was affecting him until years later. I hung up the phone and sat on the couch staring at the wall for 3 hours straight. My righteous anger about proving Kevin wrong started feeling hollow and wrong in my chest. The grilled cheese sandwich I'd been so proud of suddenly looked different in my mind. If Kevin's symptoms were real, but caused by anxiety instead of actual allergies, then I hadn't proven anything except that I could trick him. I'd fed him the exact foods that sent him to the hospital as a child while he trusted me completely. The fact that he didn't get physically sick didn't mean I hadn't triggered something deeper and scarier for him. I kept thinking about 7-year-old Kevin hooked up to the hospital machines and how terrified he must have been. Then I thought about adult Kevin eating my sandwich and telling me it was the best thing I'd ever made him while his body stayed calm because he believed he was safe. I'd taken that safety away from him on purpose to win an argument. I found Kevin in the kitchen the next morning pouring coffee into a travel mug. I tried to tell him what his mother had said, and that I wanted to understand what happened to him as a kid. He slammed the mug down on the counter so hard coffee splashed onto his hand. He told me his mother had no right to share his private medical history with me, and that childhood trauma didn't excuse what I'd done to him. I started to apologize for tricking him while trying to explain what I'd learned about anxiety and physical symptoms. He cut me off and said I was trying to manipulate him with psychology now instead of just admitting I'd been cruel. Every time I opened my mouth to speak, he talked over me saying I didn't get to play therapist after poisoning him. He grabbed his mug and keys and left for work without looking at me once. Kevin's sister showed up at our front door 2 days later carrying 2 grocery bags full of special foods. She pushed past me into the kitchen and started unpacking rice crackers and dairy-free cheese and gluten-free pasta onto our counter. She lectured me about respecting boundaries and said Kevin told her I'd been dismissing his health issues for years. She said Kevin was thinking about staying at their place for a while because he didn't feel safe eating anything in our house anymore. Something snapped in me, and I told her that Kevin eats onion rings at Buffalo Wild Wings every Sunday and pizza at his friend Mark's house at least twice a month. She stared at me like I was making things up and said I was lying because I got caught doing something horrible. She told me Kevin would never eat those foods because they make him sick, and that I was inventing stories to make myself look better. She left the groceries on the counter and walked out, telling me I needed professional help. The next week and a half turned into a nightmare of separate grocery shopping and separate meals and separate lives in the same house. I bought my regular food, and Kevin ordered expensive takeout every single night. He'd sit at the kitchen table with his phone reading every ingredient in his meal out loud like he was proving a point. I couldn't sleep because I kept replaying the hospital story and the grilled cheese in Kevin's face when I told him the truth. Kevin looked exhausted too, with dark circles under his eyes and his shoulders hunched over like he was protecting himself. We both called out sick from work 3 times because we couldn't function enough to go to the office. I checked my credit card bill online and saw we'd spent $837 on food in less than 2 weeks. We were destroying our marriage and our bank account at the same time. I called my friend from college because I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. He listened to the whole story without interrupting, and then asked me questions that made my stomach hurt. He asked if I'd ever talked to Kevin about his childhood, or why his food issues seemed so random. He asked why I assumed Kevin was manipulating me instead of asking him what was really going on with his body. He said it sounded like I'd spent 6 years being frustrated instead of 6 years trying to understand my husband. I wanted him to take my side and tell me Kevin was being dramatic, but instead he made me see that I'd never actually tried to figure out what was happening. I'd just decided Kevin was controlling me and built up years of anger without ever having a real conversation about it. I went through our filing cabinet looking for insurance papers and found medical records from 3 years ago when Kevin had a bad reaction at a restaurant. The emergency room notes said anxiety-induced gastric distress in the doctor's handwriting at the top of the page. Further down, it recommended follow-up with gastroenterology and possibly mental health services. I read the words over and over trying to remember that night. Kevin had told me the restaurant used real butter instead of the dairy-free kind he'd requested, and that's why he got sick. He never mentioned anything about anxiety or mental health. I never asked why the ER doctor wrote it that way or what it meant. I just accepted Kevin's explanation and added another restaurant to our list of places we couldn't eat. I brought the papers to Kevin that night while he was watching TV in the living room. I tried to show him what the ER doctor had written and ask him why he never told me about the mental health recommendation. He grabbed the papers out of my hand and yelled that I was going through his private medical files now like some kind of detective. He said I was trying to prove he was mentally ill, so I could win the argument about the grilled cheese. I screamed back that I was trying to understand him and that he'd been hiding important information from me for years. He yelled that I was trying to fix him like he was broken, instead of just accepting that his body works differently. I said terrible things about him using his sensitivities to control me. He said terrible things about me being cold and uncaring about his health. We both said we felt controlled and dismissed and unheard. We said things we couldn't take back about not knowing if we could stay married to each other. I packed a bag and drove to my older brother's apartment because I couldn't breathe in the same space as Kevin anymore. I told him everything while sitting on his couch, and he listened without judging either of us. Then he said something that made me cry harder than I'd cried in years. He said we both sounded completely miserable, and that being right didn't matter if our marriage was dying. He asked me if I wanted to be right about Kevin faking his allergies, or if I wanted to be married to him. I couldn't answer because I genuinely didn't know anymore. I'd been so focused on proving my point that I hadn't thought about what I actually wanted. I stayed at his place for 2 days trying to figure out if I still loved Kevin enough to fix this. I came home on the 3rd day and found Kevin sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. He looked up when I walked in, and his eyes were red from crying. He told me quietly that he knew his reactions to food were inconsistent, and that he'd been too scared to figure out why. He said he ate pizza at Mark's house and onion rings at the sports bar because he felt relaxed in those places. He admitted that the anxiety that made him sick was worse at home because he always felt like I was judging him and waiting for him to have a reaction. He said he knew that wasn't fair to me, but he didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. This was the first real conversation we'd had in 3 weeks where we weren't yelling or defending ourselves. We were just 2 people trying to tell each other the truth. We sat there at the kitchen table not saying anything for what felt like forever. I watched him wipe his eyes with the back of his hand, and I realized I was crying too. All the anger I'd been holding onto for weeks just drained out of me, and left me feeling empty and exhausted. Kevin looked at me and said he was sorry for making me feel like I couldn't talk to him about being frustrated. He told me he knew his reactions didn't make sense, and that he'd been so scared of disappointing me that he just got more and more controlling about food. I told him I was sorry for letting my frustration build up until I did something horrible like the grilled cheese trick. I admitted I'd been walking on eggshells around him for years and resenting him instead of just asking him what was really going on. We both agreed that the grilled cheese incident wasn't really about the sandwich at all. It was about 6 years of bad communication and assumptions, and neither of us feeling heard. Kevin reached across the table and took my hand, and we just sat there crying together for the first time since this whole mess started. After we both calmed down, Kevin said he would see a doctor about his stomach issues if I would agree to go to couples counseling with him. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. I felt this huge wave of relief that we were finally going to do something concrete instead of just fighting or avoiding each other. We were both scared about what we might find out from doctors and therapists, but the alternative was watching our marriage fall apart completely. That night, Kevin brought his pillow back to our bedroom instead of sleeping in the guest room. We didn't cuddle or anything, and we stayed on opposite sides of the bed, but it felt like progress. I could hear him breathing next to me, and it reminded me of when we first got married and everything felt easier. The first couples therapy session was 3 days later, and it was so awkward I wanted to leave after 5 minutes. The therapist was this woman in her 50s who had a calm voice that somehow made me more nervous. She asked us each to describe what we thought the main problem was in our marriage. Kevin went first and talked about feeling anxious all the time, that he was disappointing me with his food needs. He said he felt like I was always annoyed with him and judging him for being difficult. When it was my turn, I talked about feeling frustrated by rules that seemed to change randomly and never understanding why some foods were okay sometimes, but not other times. The therapist pointed out that we'd been having completely different experiences of the same marriage. She said Kevin had been reacting to his assumptions about what I was thinking, and I'd been reacting to my assumptions about what he was doing. We'd both been so caught up in our own stories that we never actually checked in with each other about what was real. Kevin's appointment with the gastroenterologist was the following week, and I went with him. The doctor was younger than I expected, and she asked really detailed questions about when his symptoms happened and what he was doing when they occurred. Kevin told her about eating pizza at his friend's house without problems, but getting sick from dairy at home. She ran some tests that involved Kevin drinking this gross liquid and then waiting around for an hour. When the results came back, she explained that Kevin did have mild food sensitivities to dairy and gluten, but nothing severe. The big issue was that his anxiety was making everything worse. She said when Kevin felt stressed or anxious, his body would have stronger reactions to foods that normally wouldn't bother him much. It created this cycle where he worried about getting sick, which made him more likely to actually get sick, which made him worry more. She recommended he work with both a nutritionist and a mental health professional to break the cycle. Hearing the doctor explain everything helped both of us in different ways. Kevin looked so relieved when she said his symptoms were real and not just in his head. He'd been so scared that I was right, and he'd been making everything up this whole time. I felt guilty for dismissing what he'd been going through, but I also felt validated that there was a logical explanation for why his reactions seemed so inconsistent. We drove home from the appointment mostly quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet instead of the angry silence we'd been living with. That night, we actually cooked dinner together for the first time in weeks. We made plain chicken and rice, which was safe for both of us, and we ate at the table instead of in separate rooms. In our next therapy session, we started doing these communication exercises that felt really silly at first. Kevin had to practice telling me when he was feeling anxious about food instead of just declaring things off limits without explanation. I had to practice asking questions about what he was feeling instead of making assumptions about what was happening. The therapist made us repeat things back to each other to make sure we were actually listening. At one point, she said something that hit me hard. She told me I'd been parenting Kevin around food instead of partnering with him. She said I was treating him like a child who needed to be managed rather than an adult I could talk to honestly. It was true, and I hated hearing it, but it was true. Kevin started seeing his own therapist twice a week to work on the anxiety and the childhood trauma that Natalia had told me about. He came home from those sessions looking completely drained, and sometimes he'd go straight to bed without eating dinner. But he said it was helping him understand why he'd been so controlling about meals. One night, he sat me down and apologized for using his real sensitivities as a way to manage his anxiety by controlling what we ate. He said he knew it wasn't fair to me, and that he'd been doing it without even realizing it for years. He cried when he told me about the food poisoning when he was 7, and how his dad had made fun of him for being dramatic about it. I held him while he cried, and felt terrible for not knowing any of this before. My own therapy sessions forced me to look at my part in everything. The therapist asked why I let things build up for 6 years before doing something as drastic as the grilled cheese experiment. I had to admit I'd been avoiding conflict and letting resentment pile up instead of addressing problems when they were small. She pointed out that I felt powerless in my marriage and responded by trying to prove I was right, instead of trying to fix what was broken. I apologized to Kevin for tricking him with the grilled cheese and for not being honest about my frustration years earlier when we could have dealt with it together. We met with a nutritionist who specialized in anxiety-related food issues, and she was amazing. She sat down with both of us and created an eating plan based on Kevin's actual sensitivities and his anxiety triggers. She explained that Kevin could probably handle small amounts of dairy and gluten when he was feeling relaxed, but larger amounts or eating them when he was stressed would cause real problems. She gave us specific guidelines that actually made sense instead of the confusing rules we'd been following. Having clear information helped both of us feel less anxious about meals. I could plan dinners without worrying I was accidentally hurting him, and Kevin could eat without constantly monitoring his body for reactions. Kevin's family was still mad at me about the whole situation, so we decided to have dinner at Natalia's house to try to clear the air. Kevin told me beforehand that he was going to set some boundaries with them, and I was nervous about how that would go. We got there and Anita barely looked at me while Natalia was overly polite in that way that meant she was uncomfortable. During dinner, Kevin put down his fork and told them he needed to say something. He said he appreciated their support, but they needed to let us work through this as a couple without interfering. He told them his food issues were more complicated than anyone had realized, and that I wasn't the villain they'd made me out to be. He said we were both working hard in therapy, and that's what mattered. Natalia apologized for getting too involved and said she just wanted to protect him. Anita stayed quiet and cold for the rest of the meal, but at least Kevin had stood up for us. 2 months passed, and I started to feel like we might actually make it through this. Kevin kept going to therapy twice a week, and I went to my own sessions where I worked on saying what bothered me instead of letting it build up. We were talking more than we had in years, and even though some conversations were hard, at least we were having them. Then Kevin got assigned this huge project at work with a deadline that was basically impossible. He came home exhausted every night and barely ate dinner because he was so stressed about getting everything done on time. I noticed him starting to do the old things again, like checking ingredient labels 3 times and saying he couldn't eat certain foods. One night I made chicken and vegetables for dinner and he pushed his plate away after 2 bites. He said the seasoning was too much and his stomach already felt weird. I felt that familiar anger rising in my chest because here we were right back where we started. But then I remembered what the therapist had taught us about asking questions instead of making assumptions. I took a breath and asked him if he was feeling anxious about the work project. He looked surprised, and then his eyes got watery and he nodded. He said he felt like he was drowning in deadlines and couldn't think straight. We ordered plain rice and grilled chicken from the place he trusted, and sat on the couch together while he told me about everything stressing him out at work. We didn't fight about the food at all, and it felt like actual progress. A week later, I decided to try cooking dinner for the first time in months. I made the recipe the nutritionist had given us that was supposed to work for both of us without triggering Kevin's anxiety. It was baked salmon with roasted potatoes and green beans, all seasoned with things that were on his safe list. I was so nervous setting the table that my hands were shaking a little. Kevin came into the kitchen and saw what I'd made, and he smiled at me in a way he hadn't in forever. He sat down and took a bite and told me it was delicious. We ate together at the actual table instead of in separate rooms or in front of the TV. It wasn't perfect because we were both still kind of nervous about the whole thing, but it felt like we were becoming a team again instead of enemies. Kevin brought up maybe having some friends over for dinner in a few weeks, which would have been completely impossible to imagine a few months ago. I said yes, even though the idea scared me because I wanted to keep moving forward. Our last scheduled therapy session arrived, and the therapist asked us how we planned to handle setbacks going forward. She reminded us that Kevin's anxiety wasn't going to disappear completely, and that I would probably still feel frustrated sometimes. But now we had actual tools to communicate instead of letting resentment pile up until it exploded. Kevin said he would try to tell me when he was feeling anxious instead of just declaring foods off limits without explanation. I said I would ask him what he was feeling instead of assuming he was trying to control me. We agreed to come back once a month for check-in sessions to make sure we stayed on track and didn't slip back into old patterns. 3 months after Natalia's phone call, everything felt different between us. Kevin was managing his food anxiety better with the therapy and medication his doctor prescribed. I was better at saying when something bothered me before it turned into a huge fight. We cooked together a few times a week and actually enjoyed planning meals instead of it being this terrible source of stress. Our marriage still wasn't perfect, and we both knew we had a long way to go. But at least it was honest now. We talked about real things instead of just arguing about food all the time. Last night, I made a tiny portion of my grandmother's lasagna recipe that I hadn't touched in 4 years. I gave Kevin a small piece and he tried it and said it was amazing. He didn't have any reaction, and we both smiled at each other across the table. It felt like a quiet victory for both of us after everything we'd been through.